Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Hey, it's Danny Pellegrino from Everything Iconic. Ready to upgrade your style game without blowing your budget? Check out Quince. They've got all the good stuff, shirts and polos, activewear, and fine leather goods, all at 50 to 80% less than other high-end brands. And the best part? They're all about safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get that luxury vibe without the luxury price tag. Hit up quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's quince.com/upgrade.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonicist and the first installment of War of 1812 month. This will probably be the last of the themed months. Spoiler there for you. There are changes likely to be afoot on the Napoleonicist. Patrons, you will be informed well in advance. Please do not worry. But we are going to go out with something of a bang. There's a huge amount of content incoming in terms of debates, discussions about memory and impact of this conflict. And it's a learning curve for me. This is not a conflict that I will consider myself to be au fait in. I know the basics, obviously. But it's going to be a journey for me as much as it is for you. And how better to start off on that journey than throwing ourselves in at the deep end. And who better to plunge us into the icy cold waters of this conflict? I think that's an apt metaphor. I'm going with it. Why not? Then my good buddy Josh Provan, who I'm now going to refer to as my Napoleonicist correspondent and consultant historian. There we go, Josh. You are a consultant historian. It's a thing because I just said so.
Putting it in the bio. I'm putting it in the bio right now.
Fantastic. There we go. We're owning it. Job done. Though I can't promise you a substantial fee for your consultancy work. I do apologize. This is terrible. You'll have to take me to court over it. But before we get there, let's try and distract Josh by heaping praise upon him because he's a praiseworthy individual. Author of Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira. I'm going to ditch the bad jokes now because they're so... Oh, wait. I've just gone and made the bad joke. What a shame. He's also master of Adventures in Historyland, a brilliant show that, folks, you need to go and subscribe on YouTube to, covering literally everything. It feels like there's nothing this guy doesn't know and can't offer an informed take on. It's fascinating. As I say, Napoleonicist regular, kind of correspondent, part of the furniture. I'm going to get a bench named after you, I suspect. And, always digs me out of a tight spot by providing some really interesting stuff on things I'm embarrassingly ignorant about. And we are doing exactly that today because we're going to talk about Native Americans in the War of 1812. Yes, you will get some of the predictable, inverted commas stuff, the stuff you would expect, things about how the war starts and its legacy and combat and all the rest of it and its course. And there might be something about Provan coming. Details are still being worked out as this is being recorded. All of that will come, but we're not going to forget the indigenous population, the First Nation, the people who were there long before Europeans got itchy feet and headed over to the inverted commas New World. It wasn't a new world. because it had always been there. Josh, welcome. That was a very waffly introduction, but it's good to see you, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to it. As I said before, when I was doing the prep for this, it was very enjoyable. I don't get to travel in history land through the War of 1812 all that much, although I do enjoy it when I do. So this is going to be fun.
It absolutely is. We do like our kind of niche topics from time to time on this podcast. I kind of feel Native Americans shouldn't be kind of niche, although is Native American the right term? I suppose is just one thing to get off the to address off the bat, because First Nations is perhaps better. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about what term do you use. Is Indigenous the best word? I don't really know anymore.
Yeah, the discussion about what term to apply to the people of the Americas has occupied a great deal of time and is something that is yet to be resolved, and it has changed so much that it has its own sort of section of historiography practically in study. The trends in scholarship and things like that, and popular memory. I suppose you could do a paper on it very easily. Frankly, I believe that it depends. Most accurately, I think the most accurate you can possibly do is to try, where possible, to refer to the nations specifically rather than as a whole. Failing that, you should, and I think it's good to remember that most of the Native Americans I've ever been in contact with or seen on documentaries or have spoken about this all tend to have their own opinion on this as well. Some prefer Indian now because it's just they've just owned it. Some prefer, for instance, if you were active in civil rights in the 70s and 80s, you might prefer American Indian, as was promoted by the American Indian movement. Then obviously between the 80s and 90s and 2000s, Native American is a very politically correct term. But as anybody from the 80s will say, the argument against that is, well, that means anybody can be a Native American technically if you were born in North America, anywhere in the Americas. So they're all interchangeable, and like I say, I've found the best way to sort of navigate it is just to try, where possible, to use the actual nations involved. Sometimes that is not possible when talking about large wars and groups, of course. So then you fall back on simply that you just make it known that you're being respectful. You're not using it as a pejorative, whatever word you use, because sometimes you do have to use the historical terms as well. The answer is there is no answer to this question. You just have to do your best.
A podcast guest's nightmare, a question to which there is no answer, but nicely handled. And I think hopefully we've kind of done our best to demonstrate that if we are using a term that causes offence, firstly, apologies, but that is not the intent. And please do take this in the spirit in which it is given, which is that we are trying to enlighten people about a section of history that often gets pushed to the sidelines.
To put it mildly, in current popular terminology, this subject is not properly decolonized. Therefore, it's almost impossible to offend someone or make someone feel uncomfortable when talking about this. And I'm talking about either side here, in this thing.
So let's take it back a bit, shall we? I remember quite vividly studying what were known as the French Indian Wars, which predate the American Revolution. They are an extension of the 7 Years' War, but they're essentially what's happening. They're kind of a manifestation of that conflict in North America, but there's more to it than that because there are different underlying tensions, and there's a sort of slightly different political thing. But of course, war breaking out in Europe is a convenient excuse to then go on the offensive against the French, and for the French to go on the offensive against the British, and so you see that conflict play out. I always feel that actually the disappearance of competition between the settling nations actually doesn't do the Native American population, for want of a better term, much good, because now the British can sit there and get complacent, and arguments can be built that it's part of that complacency that then leads ultimately to the situation that causes the American Revolution / War of Independence. So where am I going with this waffly kind of comment rather than question? Well, I guess what I'm asking is that how are the Native Americans affected by the American colonies gaining independence? Because we've got this long run-in of a very complex situation where they're valued and then they're seen as a hindrance and then they're seen as somewhere in between. They're potential allies, then they're not, then they're people that can be traded with, they have local knowledge. It's a complex melting pot, but obviously there's a sea change or a scope for a sea change when the British are kicked out of the 13 colonies, and those 13 colonies become the fledgling United States of America. Obviously the Brits are still around, they're up in Canada. Canada doesn't break away. So obviously this is going to kind of vary by region, but how are the Native American tribes affected by this change, and quite significant change in the political dynamic in the region?
Well, to put it mildly, the American War of Independence, the way it panned out in the Treaty of Paris, that completely excluded any sort of Native American input in the way it was signed and agreed upon, left every nation from the Ohio to the Mississippi vulnerable to encroachment by the former British colonies. At the end of the American War of Independence, and specifically from the acceptance of the Constitution in 1788, marks the end of the first phase of the gradual eradication of indigenous sovereignty, which began with the initial explorations, conquests, and colonizations of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts by Europeans in the 15th century. One of the complaints leveled against the British government in the 1770s, actually, was the embargo on settlement of the Ohio Valley after the 7 Years' War. The British were trying to cut costs back then, and constantly fighting coalitions of Indians had proven very expensive. And after Pontiac's War and the almost simultaneous Cherokee War in the 1760s and 1770s, it was found that trying to keep the colonies and Native American nations apart seemed the best course of action. And of course, it didn't pan out because the American Revolution happened. So during the Revolution itself, intense fighting between the Ohio Indians and the westernmost colonists ended with the Ohio Confederates being driven back, which is a podcast in itself with the American Revolution, if anybody wants to do one of those. But with the British gone, there was no longer any barrier to westward expansion, of the United States. They could now just pile into the territories that were ceded by the British, who, with rich sort of cheek almost, just said, all the Ohio, which we don't properly own, we just sort of have claim to, is now the United States, is now territory of the United States of America. So the large bulk of the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, bordering the Great Lakes, is handed over to the Americans, and they call that the Northwest Territories of the United States. And they use this ostensibly to satisfy the debts incurred by fighting the British. A so-called Southern Territory existed in what is now Tennessee as well. Now, through the 1780s, the United States struggled to create a nation against looming political division and economic hardship. The problem of overpopulating contested land claimed by people who didn't care that no Indian nation had signed the Treaty of Paris, sorry to bang that drum, grew. And the British stoked fires from the Canadian border, supporting and inciting Native American nations to raid the territories, hoping that the USA would collapse politically of its own accord, and encouraged raiding, which in turn prompted snatch and burn operations from the Kentucky frontiersmen and new colonists flooding in from the east. By 1791, about 100 60,000 of the United States' estimated 4 million strong population were living in the Ohio frontier along the borders of Pennsylvania, Virginia, what would become Kentucky, and a full-scale war of suppression took place against a percentage of the 70,000 native inhabitants of the Ohio. At the Battle of the Wabash in 1791, though, and it's time to get your cheering hats on now, boys, Little Turtle of the Miami destroyed a 1,700-man U.S. army, which stood as their greatest defeat by a foreign power until the 20th century, and one of the largest battles of the so-called Indian Wars. And the reason why the US Army exists to this very day was this disaster, St. Clair's defeat, as it was called. It kicked off the so-called Northwest Indian War, which ended with the American victory at Fallen Timbers in 1794, and the Treaty of Grenville, which followed the year after, in which the British surrendered Detroit. And the Americans now found themselves in receipt of the land necessary to create the state of Ohio, which entered the Union in 1803. But this, with continuing creation of more territories for settlement, encouraged more of the same problems that we have just covered. So it's going to be a sort of a continuing circle of this sort of thing going forwards.
Why? Why are we just so... Oh. That's not my most profound comment ever, I have to admit, but it's just staggering. Sorry, I need to get a grip of myself. But the way in which we just trample on these people is just remarkable.
The Treaty of Paris is actually really important in what happens, because nobody took into account to consult the nations involved in who are living in the Ohio. I mean, even the Iroquois, who got split up and got kicked into Canada and stuff like that, they didn't get a say in what was happened because they were assumed to be loyalists, and so they got land in Canada. But the people who had to stay in what, I mean, it's not even settled territory. The Ohio had been one of the reasons why the French and Indian War happened, settlement of the Ohio. And yeah, the fact that the British basically just said, this land, which we basically assumed was ours, which we were kind of keeping as a sort of an Indian held place, well, we can't hold it anymore because we lost the war. So it's yours, United States. Good luck with it. And you get the beginnings of the next phase in the great sort of civilizational disaster of the colonization of the of North America.
This is what happens when you don't consult local people about things that have a dramatic impact locally. Let's not go off on a rant about British and colonial attitudes. Much though, yes, okay, they belong in this period because this is the period of them. It doesn't mean you have to look at them now and think, oh yeah, that was a great idea. Let's instead bring the focus back to the Native Americans. What's their way of life like? Because I'm going to be honest with you, I am not prepared to trust the extensive research that I did by watching The Last of the Mohicans. I think you're going to tell me that some of the stuff in there isn't even correct.
Shocking, right? Hollywood sometimes puts story before accuracy. What madness is this?
What are you on about? What are you on about? It's a documentary. I saw it on TV. It has to be true.
Daniel Day-Lewis did so much research. So the nations of the Ohio and the Mississippi lived in organized towns and villages and wider networks of the same, and they were connected by trails and in some places roads. The setup in certain parts was organized on seasonal lines, and communities might move around depending on the hunting or plowing season, stocking up agricultural produce before moving to winter hunting camps. So they operated a subsistence farming and hunter-gathering model, sort of like that. Most of them had subgroups or clans, and generally these were matrilineal. And in addition to that, they, by this point, had been in contact with Euro-Americans for so long that commingling was very common, with many adopted or mixed race Europeans and Americans living with various nations, especially in the Ohio. But to be honest, actually, this was very common up and down the eastern seaboard. Many had begun to adopt Eastern ways and use Eastern names. However, and they lived also in recognizably sort of Euro-American ways, indistinguishable in some cases from the so-called settlers, to the extent that many nations practiced even chattel bondage and slavery. Many also in Brantford, Ontario, and Salem, Ohio, and Moravian Town, which I believe is in what was called the province of, I want to say Upper Canada, but I'm sure all the Canadian historians in there will be bashing me on the head if I got that wrong. But these were now, a lot of these people were now second generation Christians. One prominent chief, Tao Yaron Toyo, I'm going to massacre a lot of these traditional names, which means between the logs, apparently, of the Wyandotte, became a Methodist minister. And even the Shawnee prophetic movement, which we'll get to in a minute, was based on the understanding of a Christian afterlife. In terms of traditional structure, though, the men functioned as defenders, warriors, hunters, public leaders, if you might say, and general providers. And women controlled, and I mean this legally, the home and the harvest. Many nations required the consent of senior women in major decisions for anything to happen, and nothing functioned without their direction. However, the pressure of white encroachment and a bewildering series of treaties between 1803 and 1809, designed to try and achieve the annexation of the it tried to had sort of like the long-term aim of trying to achieve annexation by assimilation, meant that the stability was hard to come by, and thus most nations were ever in danger of outside interference. And when you get that sort of an environment, radical thinking to solve those problems is never far away.
It's fascinating to hear what you say about this kind of cultural assimilation that ends up going on. And I guess like almost kind of willingness to embrace a different way of life. Let's break this down by region, though. Which tribes effectively are where? I mean, we're talking about obviously Ohio and Canada, but what else are we talking about here? And what were the relationships like with white settlers? Obvious place to start is start with Canada and work our way south, because we have something called Tecumseh's War, I think it might be the pronunciation, which isn't a promising notion when we talk about relations between settlers and indigenous populations.
Yeah, okay, so starting in Canada, you have the remnants of the loyalist Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, crowded along the edge of the Great Lakes and the parcels of the United States. Then from there into what is now Wisconsin and Western Illinois and Indiana, you have roughly from north to south the Ojibwe, Ho-Chunk, better known as the Winnebago, the Meskwaki, also the Sauk, also known as the Fox, Kickapoo, Miami, Wea, and Piankishaw, Peoria, and Kaskaskia. And this is like from north to south through western and eastern, the western eastern parts of those three places I just mentioned. Then you get through from Michigan, Ohio, and eastern Illinois. It's the Wyandotte, Potawatomi, Seneca, Ottawa, Lenape, also known as Delaware, and Shawnee. When you reach Kentucky and Tennessee, the nations become larger in terms of territory, at least, or at least that used to be the case. And moving through Tennessee, you find the Cherokee further south into Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. You get the Muskogee, who are also known as the Creek, and the Chickasaw and Choctaw. And in Florida, you get an emerging Muskogee breakaway nation of the Seminoles. Now, due to the ravages of diseases, wars, cultural assimilation, depopulation of communities, and stuff like that, the numbers you're looking at are in the hundreds of thousands of people, probably never approaching 500,000 in the entire area east of the Mississippi, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, compared to the millions of Euro-Americans ever hungry for land pushing west. And let's be honest, the great injustice here is the fact that between 1791 and 1812, westward settlement to support the now 8 million strong population of the United States, based on an arbitrary claim derived from a treaty they did not include, banging the drum again, the present owners of the land in question, and conveyanced by the then groundless creation of around 5 territories and new states, saw the systematic loss of millions of acres of land from sovereign nations, driving them further west into increasingly small areas of contested space and opening the road to future conflicts which would occur on the Great Plains later in the 19th century. Relations-wise, each nation had its own agendas and sub-agendas. In this period, unity was not terribly common due to religious and political shifts throughout the nations involved. However, the majority saw at least the British as an ally that might be useful in creating a firm border with the USA. Now, you mentioned a chap called Tecumseh. I believe I watched a movie in which that was how they pronounced his name, and so I'm going to go with that. Tecumseh's war, Tecumseh fought a war, and named it after him. And it's very common to actually call wars with Native Americans after the principal leader, or who you think is the principal leader. And so actually that Northwestern Indian War was actually called Little Turtles War at one point. You get later on in this, you get Black Hawk's War, stuff like that. So Tecumseh's war grew out of a specific prophetic movement, which I mentioned earlier, started by his younger brother, whose name was Tenskwatwa. But that was the name he became known as. He's also popularly known as the Prophet. Tenskwatwa was a holy man who had preached visions of salvation given to him by the Great Spirit, first just for the Shawnee, which was where the brothers came from. And then when he gained momentum for this was expanded to all Native Americans. Tenskwatwa built towns for his followers as he moved around, and whenever they were built, they became known as a prophet's town. And at its heart, this was a message of fundamental purification and unity, but it took some ugly turns, such as the burning of accused witches and the slaughter of dogs. It also incited animosity of conservative individualists among other tribes. So except for the murderous sanctity of the movement, it was officially against confrontation with the United States, arguing that unity would bring security. One might reject the prophet. I found this sort of amusing by saying something wry like, "I could not slaughter my dogs." The wish for some sort of security came in the period between 1803 and 1809, when a series of treaties that I alluded to earlier, with the Miami, Potawatomi, and Lenape, ceded vast tracts of land to the United States in hopes of making a border finally stick. Factions arose between the nations of the Ohio, with the Prophetstown coalition becoming increasingly at odds with leaders like Little Turtle, who preferred to continue to try and enforce the standing treaties. I mean, Little Turtle as well, and lots of the chiefs of those nations I just mentioned was also heavily invested in trying to make this deal with the United States work, because he had sold off a lot of the land to Prophet. In 1807, the Prophet's brother Tecumseh, a noted war leader, began having visions as well. But in these, he foresaw a united Indian nation led by a council of elected chiefs and a firm border with the USA. And he set out to rally support, sending adherents back to Provincetown as he ranged across the Old West, as you might call it. And he remained somewhat under the radar as a result. Now, the Shawneese brothers' dreams of a united nation to oppose the United States were opposed by these chiefs, as I said before, such as Little Turtle. And this is where you get collisions within the Native American nations that are going to cause problems down the line. Now, a unified movement had been suggested before by people like Joseph Brant of the Mohawk, whose, I believe, proper name is something like Tein Denegay or something like that. I do apologize. It's the Mohawk have very, very complicated names for a dumb European to say. But after the American Revolution, there had been also other prophets with similar gospels. So all of this sort of stuff was sort of accessible to people. It wasn't going away, these ideas of unity and purification and trying to change the way things were in order to stave off American interference. But the thing is that none of these former people had the gifts of oratory that the Shawnee brothers had. They were magnetic speakers. Now their message spread far and wide, all the way down to the Muskogee lands in the south. Now, unfortunately, much of what Little Turtle and his sort of allies feared did come to pass as a result of these teachings, because they foresaw that by trying to gather everybody together into one group, you were just going to cause civil wars. You were going to cause faction. This absolutely happened. The visionaries' message factionalized most of the nations it spread to into war and peace camps, and encouraged civil war, and left many nations vulnerable to American mediation and just outright interference. In 1810, the governor of Indiana Territory and future president William Henry Harrison, who had been striving to control the situation because the other complicated thing is the Americans didn't want just masses of Native American civil wars breaking out. They wanted to be able to control the situation. But he was confronted by the force of nature that was Tecumseh at Grouseland Mansion. The meeting almost ended in bloodshed and left the USA with no doubts that Prophetstown needed to be destroyed. At the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, Harrison achieved his aim and laid a platform on which to use to run for president in the future, as it turned out. And Tecumseh returned, because he was away sort of gathering support when this happened. He returned to find many of his friends dead and his brother in hiding. Fired by revenge, he accepted the British offer to command their Native American allies in the Ohio when war broke out the next year. And so Tecumseh's War basically flows into the War of 1812 and represents Tecumseh's goal of using this event to try and build his new nation. It was the continuation also of the complicated politics of the Old Northwest, and an important part of the fallout of the westward expansion of the United States, which is already on the cards as the exploration of the Louisiana Purchase repeats the absurdity of arbitrarily claiming land you've never seen owned by people that you've never met. And when most of the Midwest was bought from Napoleon in 1803 and explored by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 and 1806, this is just literally history rhyming, if not just totally going against Mark Twain and repeating itself.
I mean, just the hilarity of the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, in some respects, it's not funny, obviously, but in other respects, it really is. This idea, we're just going to buy this big slab of land. No idea what's there. But you don't want it, we'll have it. It just... was Napoleon dissatisfied? Did he think he should have asked for a higher price later on?
I do seem to recall some sort of gripe. He might have said that he could have asked for more because he was rather pressed for time, and I think the USA felt that they got a really good deal, and indeed they did, as it turned out. But Napoleon needed money to finance his wars, and 1803 things were going to kick off pretty quickly. So, yeah, hindsight.
I mean, is it a buyer's market or a seller's market? That's always the existential question, isn't it? back to the tribes. What I'm liking from what you're saying here is that it chimes with what I certainly picked up when I was studying the 7 Years' War as a precocious and spotty, it has to be said, 17-year-old, which is this kind of this sense that the tribes aren't idle. They know the situation, and they know how to try and manipulate that situation. So, they're not sitting back idly during the War of 1812. There is a strategy, but it kind of feels to me like there's a lot of scope to back the wrong horse here. The stakes seem to get higher and higher and more fraught as the 18th century moves into the 19th century, and expansionism becomes more and more obviously on the American agenda. So is there any sense of, let's just let these European settlers fight it out, and then we'll deal with whatever fallout there is? Or is there this sense that if you do back the right horse, then perhaps you can get back what you had before?
Yeah, there is a lot of that, I think. But it also depends where you are, and it's a bit of both even then. The days of being able to play the Europeans off against each other have mostly gone now. Because, as you said at the beginning, it's resolved down to the British in Canada, and the United States apparently own everything else, which, nobody had told us about, is the feeling you get. But the increasing focus of the United States as a result on developing the land towards the Mississippi means that there is no option but to surrender land or fight. I mean, that's the stark simplicity of it. Tecumseh and his brother popularly represent the effective attempt to unite in the face of impossible odds and make the Ohio River the border of their sort of domain. As does the Potawatomi, tongue-tied, as does the actions of the Potawatomi chief Mein Pok. The war between Britain and the United States offered him the chance to perhaps win back the ceded territories, and indeed all of those involved in actually fighting the United States. The ceded territories lost in 1809 due to the land sales of people like Churchill and stuff like that, and create this union of nations that was really very visionary for Tecumseh and his brother to think up, considering the pressures that were being put on them at the time. Certainly, some of the British actually liked this idea. After capturing Detroit during the War of 1812, there was some hope of an end to the war, actually, since the Orders in Council that had started it, and I'm sure we'll get into the causes of the war and stuff in another episode, had actually been rescinded in hopes of stopping the conflict before it started. Now, the British officer in command of the operation to take Detroit was Isaac Brock, and his coup threatened this from actually being achieved. And knowing this, he wrote to the Earl of Liverpool that no peace should be made without the establishment of an Indian territory ruled only by British allied Indians. And this was an idea with which Lord Bathurst agreed with, and might have some bearing on why early attempts to stop the war didn't work out. It cannot be too highly stressed, therefore, how important the Native Americans contingent in Brock's and General Proctor's forces were to the overall strategy along the Great Lakes to the British. Anyway, the fact that the coalition formed by Tecumseh also had their own agenda is just sort of some icing on the cake there, that it's not just the British trying to get them to dance to their tune, they're trying to get something out of this. Meanwhile, the five main nations of the Southeast kind of attempted to keep out of the Euro-American wars, but were under equal pressure from encroachment and strong-arm tactics, and indeed were vulnerable to factionalism due to the preachings of Tecumseh and the sort of the Shawnee prophetical movement. And for example, the Muskogee or the Creeks embarked on their own war that had nothing really to do with the rather vague struggle with the United States and Britain. So the change here is to see that the British are keen to use existing rifts and conflicts caused by the United States' Indian policy to destabilize the former colonies in return for political gain, rather than the Native Americans being caught in a war they have no stake in. Strategy in a Native American context was based on maximum damage for minimal cost, striking at isolated forts and towns and attempting to overwhelm defense forces without committing to a costly battle. This, unfortunately, was rarely possible given the Euro-American resources and predilection for stand-up fighting. Oftentimes, of course, they would be attached to allied European or American forces, and they would act as they saw fit according to the strategy being undertaken. So things have changed a little, in the pre 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, specifically the Iroquois tried to play the French off against the British. And one of the big results of the 7 Years' War was actually they lost out because they could no longer play the British off against the French. And then, of course, the American Revolution happened. It was just disastrous for the Native Americans in that basically, it's always like a curving grade to grade the Europeans in America from a Native American perspective, but the worst ones won from their perspective, and this is what you have now.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
I'm interested there about what you were saying about service as well, and what these people are doing. Just flesh that out a little bit for us. What are these Native Americans doing on a practical level? Because it's very easy to put together some caricature style image of people with Cherokee headdresses, acting as scouts and almost sort of guerrilla style operations. But what's the reality? Because there's a small kernel in there which is local knowledge, right, and knowledge of the ground, and that's valuable. But are these guys like forming militias? Is this almost that the British try and do to the Native Americans what Wellington does to the Spanish? Just train them along British Army lines and give them a musket and give them discipline, and maybe they'll turn out to be hardy warriors. Is that a philosophy?
In a sort of a malicious sense, I believe there is some intake of Native Americans, especially, as I said, in areas that are already very integrated with Euro-American populations. This has always been the case in Canada, where you get populations like the Métis and stuff like that, and so you're already looking at, in quotes, Indians fighting like Europeans. But the great problem with trying to get hold of the sovereign nations' warriors and train them to stand in lines and shoot each other from 50 yards is that they think that's stupid, and it is stupid. Like I said before, their way of fighting is much more sensible and really something only modern soldiers can really grasp. That basically, they don't want to lose anybody. They want to attack, take no casualties, capture as many people as possible, and take them back for ransom and make examples of them and stuff like that. Doing what the Europeans do doesn't make any sense. That's why there was so much trouble in trying to control war bands Like when battles got really tough and they started losing warriors, they just said, obviously, we're not going to get through this without losing a lot more men, so we should preserve ourselves and get out. That's why you don't see the mobilization along regular lines. But on this score, you do see Allied contingents fulfilling a number of specific roles in conventional campaigns where they functioned as an auxiliary to the main force. They had smaller parts to play in coastal operations on the eastern seaboard where native population was pretty much non-existent, and there were conventional light troops were more than sufficient. But the more intelligent officers who had experience on the Great Lakes and Ohio and Canadian backcountry knew that military success depended on the support of native allies. These, I mean, it is a bit of a cliche, but it's just 100% true. They were peerless scouts and guides, adept at concealment and stealth in a way only modern soldiers understand, ready-made for raiding and punitive expeditions, as the way of warfare was just, like I said, traditionally based about taking prisoners and minimizing casualties rather than just killing, and so in a way what they were doing requires much more intelligence. This aspect of raiding was also used psychologically by the British, knowing as they did the fear that Indian war bands inspired. And as you said before, local knowledge of the terrain and people, seasons and the routes and portages between through the forests and between the lakes and rivers is massively important, because in North America, that knowledge is often the difference between victory and defeat. And it's fairly common to read accounts of soldiers acknowledging their worth as hunters as well. In battle, they were masters of bush warfare and ambush, through, though, as I said, prone to disengage if they took too many casualties. In European-style stand-up fights, they were usually used as a screening force, and then they sort of moved away to the flanks to harass the enemy from indirect positions. And given the terrain that constituted much of the northern, southern, and western theaters of the war, and the context in which he understood war, a native warrior was a really powerful asset to any army operating in these areas. At the start of the war, for instance, when preparing for action, General Brock wrote to his American counterpart in Detroit that, quote, "It is far from my intention to join a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the moment the contest commences." The unsaid threat rather lingered in the air when you considered 600 men of his 1,300 strong force were allied warriors, that one witness on their side said looked like something the devil had let out of hell for an hour's recreation on earth. With many considering the Detroit corridor therefore undefended, the Americans surrendered the fort without firing a shot, rather than test Brock's resolve to unleash his horde from hell on the Ohio.
Just that mentality of, they look like demons. We shall run away. We cannot withstand the spawn of Satan.
Exactly. And to be honest, the Native Americans kind of didn't mind that. I mean, the warriors were there to put on a show. They knew they could project that fear. They could get people to run away, and because their way of warfare came from essentially a hunting society, don't run from the hunters, and that's what they want you to do. They absolutely wanted these Europeans to be terrified of them and compare them to devils. That suited them fine, because when you're in a war, you don't care if people are mean to you. In fact, they probably thought, excellent, things working out really well. I should get more of this. I should get more feathers.
Is there mutual respect, or is there stigma attached here? Because I'm thinking Peninsular War, apologies, folks, but that is my area. The British do love to have a scapegoat and blame the locals when something goes wrong. Do you see equivalents? here?
There are sometimes equivalents, yes, because of the Native American habit of, like I say, fighting only really when it suits them and when they have a distinct advantage. This is not to say they won't fight if they're outnumbered. In fact, they often can take out larger forces than they are fighting. They can inflict terrible casualties on larger forces, and the enemy will think that they had twice their number just because of the way they used the terrain. But because of their way of because they were prone to not fighting on if it was going against them, many operations that prove unsuccessful were often blamed on the uncooperative nature of the Allies. As you saw there was often colorful allusions to, them being savage monsters. And while, of course, in a combat situation, that is a good thing for a soldier to project, it's also shouldn't be taken as what they were. These were human beings with families and stuff like that. So there's both. You might just, first of all, as we've sort of been touching on through the entire thing, you might as well assume that the entire world at this time has a sort of racial bias and didn't really see anything wrong with that.
You can see very clear parallels, can't you, with sort of that Roman attitude of anything that's not, inverted commas, civilized, i.e. under our jurisdiction, and is visually and culturally almost like a mirror to what we do, is classified as, inverted commas, barbarian. And it's not necessarily a case of a lack of civilization, it's just othering.
Exactly. And literally the European civilization comes from the Roman model. And so there should be no surprise that this is sort of the hardwired into people's brains. So the Euro-Americans definitely saw the Native Americans as savages, and that they needed tamed and educated, and at the same time they lived in a dreadful fear of having to fight them. Allied warriors were routinely talked about in terms of revulsion and disgust due to their apparent heartless cruelty in war, and let's not sugarcoat this, they could be very nasty if you came across them. This isn't to say that colonial and European militias and even regulars sometimes didn't commit depravities upon native populations, but this is not a nice time to be fighting wars in the back country of North America. Let's just put it that way. Most regulars from Europe and settlers from the East commonly called them devils and wretches and miserable things and reviled them, especially when Tecumseh seemed to be calling all the shots in 1813. That riled a lot of people when he seemed to actually be bossing Proctor around, which he kind of was. And maybe it would have been better if he'd been allowed to continue doing so. But some, like Brock, seemed to truly admire their allies, and many indeed, as we've seen, chose to integrate themselves with them. Even on the American side, men like Sam Houston, who is famous for being famous for the Texas Revolution. He was an adopted part of the Cherokee Nation, and honestly said once that he preferred the freedom he'd found there to anything else he'd known. So it's a complicated thing, but yes, you're definitely seeing sort of this, they are the other, we respect them as warriors, but we don't really understand where they're coming from. And the majority, that's probably for the majority at the time.
Why does this not particularly surprise me? And yes, folks, I know people are going to say, well, look, it's the 19th century, this shouldn't be surprising, and hence my sarcasm. No, it's not surprising, but that doesn't mean that we need to look upon it and go, oh yes, that was absolutely right, and in no way outdated even back then. But it was the norm, of course it was, and you can see exactly the same thing happening elsewhere. In some respects, there was an inclination to denigrate warriors in India, not to the same extent, it should be said, but there was nonetheless this sense that you needed white men to control these people and make them realize their potential, because they couldn't do that on their own.
Exactly. I think that it's interesting that Europeans seem to have a much, almost, certainly with their own sepoys and stuff like that, they seem to have a much less sort of regard for their prowess without European supervision, we'll put it that way. They thought they were brave and everything like that. They were superb fighters and stuff, but you don't quite get the same sense of these are things of the forest that you get when people talk about Native American war bands and stuff.
So let's talk specifics, let's talk events, let's talk dates, and sadly, let's talk bloodshed. In terms of actual fighting, let's look at some of these actions that they're involved in. And I want to do that through some of the big names. So let's kick off with the sort of the thread that you've already been laying out for us, which is Tecumseh.
Definitely. He's a very interesting guy, and I recommend people look him up and read more about him, because he's one of the great. He's really up there with the like more legendary figures, like or popularly legendary figures like Sitting Bull and people like that. But Tecumseh is very important to the war effort, and especially to men like General Proctor. Because he was a popular figure able to rally people to him. He was much more impressive than Proctor, let's put it that way. And hopes of a great Indian army to descend on the Ohio were mainly pinned on his charisma. And that was absolutely something the British were hoping to try and do. In the spring of 1813, the British force of around 900 regulars and militia were ready to invade the United States and boasted 1,300 Allied warriors as their main strike force. This is very large numbers. You're going to see much larger numbers of Allied warriors than practically any other war, certainly since the French and Indian War. And more were coming in from as far away as the Great Plains every day, and this is absolutely down to Tecumseh's message. And you really needed a man like him to control a native force of that size and keep it in the field for the reasons I've said before, because they're essentially, the traditionalists are there for loot and to make their names as warriors, and they'll go home when they're done, and others will go home once they believe the objective is attained, and others will stick around because of the charisma of individual war leaders and stuff like that. You needed someone like Tecumseh to get that force moving. And he had actually made an abortive attempt to take the field in 1812, but had actually been defeated and wounded in that effort. His return in 1813 with his great supposedly united war party, which was anything but, coincided with Proctor's siege of Fort Meigs against General Harrison. It's Mr. President again, by the way. A fiasco that irritated and dispirited Tecumseh's men. These were issues that directly influenced the massacre of prisoners on the orders of an Ottawa chief called Spilett-Nose after an engagement called Dudley's Defeat. And this, again, sadly, was something that tended to happen when disgruntled Native American allies were ignored or in terms of what they wanted out of a campaign, and you didn't have a sufficient guard on the prisoners that were taken. And to be honest with you, sometimes you just couldn't do anything about it. British soldiers were shot defending American soldiers in some of these instances. So it's just something, if you're going to do war with large amounts of native allies, this is one of the things that you have to prepare for, and not a lot of people did. A common lack of progress in Proctor's campaign saw the warriors begin to desert. By the time Proctor retreated, he had only a token force of the terrifying host, in quotes, that he had begun the campaign with. That being said, whole populations now fled to the British forts in the north, fearing American reprisals. And by the summer, Tecumseh's magnetism had gathered 3,500 warriors. And he persuaded Proctor to try again to take Fort Meigs. And this time, Tecumseh seemed to be almost in strategic command, which, as I said before, really made a lot of people angry. But that was the way it was. He at least had some sort of a plan that was more audacious. Whether it was the correct plan, that's for some other day to talk about. But this met with no greater success against stubborn American resistance, and Tecumseh likens fighting the Americans in their forts to fighting groundhogs. The chiefs were not pleased with the British either. Tecumseh was at his wit's end with Proctor, and he was apoplectic when he was asked to retreat with him to the Thames River in the face of an American offensive in September of 1813, and planned to end the alliance. Now, the Sauk leader, Black Hawk, who would later be famous in his own right, similarly fed up, and he just went home when he had the British, in quotes, and this is a direct quote, were making preparations to retreat. I was now tired of being with them, our success being bad, and having gotten no plunder. That's to give an idea of what some people were in this for. The retreat involved some 1,200 warriors and their families, and Proctor's small force retreated, and this operation ended in disaster at the Battle of the Thames in October. Up until now, it has to be said that it was hard to gauge if Tecumseh was as talented a general as some say or not, but he was certainly better than Proctor. His death in this battle was the end of the great dream of Native American unity in the Northwest, and the end of the Grand Alliance with the British. All the tribes went home pretty much when he died. It was a great tragedy, and it is celebrated in a strange way throughout American popular history, the death of Tecumseh. You can see it in popular engravings, there's carvings of it, steles. It's absolute folk legend is Tecumseh and the final stand. But it didn't end the way he hoped, and this is the end, obviously the end of Tecumseh's war.
He sounds like a phenomenal talent. It's a pity, really.
Very, very tragic.
Though, of course, that is war. So next up, we have John Norton. Now, his story has this sort of air of Hollywood about it. Are you going to tell me that, Mel Gibson's going to suddenly jump into this Zoom call and sort of do whatever the podcasting equivalent is of photobombing this interview?
I'm in two minds as to whether that would be a good thing or not, because, he would bring the cash to get it to the screen, and that would make me very tempted to say yes.
I mean, I was actually going to say, in a flippant kind of way, it would automatically be a bad thing, because with the best will in the world, yes, the films are entertaining. They're not known for the historical content. But if it brings sponsorship, who knows? I'm open to offers.
We'll help you with the screenplay, Mel. But I guess the fact that he was mostly on the British side would probably discount him as fodder for Mel's production machine, I guess.
This is true. So Norton, talk me through it.
Okay. John Norton was an adopted Mohawk who had some Cherokee blood from his mostly Scottish parents. After service in the British Army, he had become interested in the Iroquois way of life and became a protege of Joseph Brant, the famous Iroquois leader from the American Revolution. And eventually, he was adopted into Brant's family as a nephew. He traveled widely and done a lot of work with Brant when conflict broke out at Prophetstown, and he was involved in the Tippecanoe campaign in 1811 and rallied to Brock at Detroit in 1812, despite official Haudenosaunee, and again, that's the proper term for the Iroquois, neutrality. Norton and Brant's son played a conspicuous part in the Battle of Queenston Heights, and this shows us a psychological effect again of the presence of warriors could have when the appearance of just 300 Iroquois ruined the morale of the American militia simply by overrunning a few outposts at the decisive moment. When war whoops were heard during the final British attack and were taken up by the advancing line infantry, the militia fled in terror and couldn't be brought back into action. And Norton was also present employing his similar psychological presence of his warriors at the Battle of Beaver Dams, and you just have to love a lot of the names in the War of 1812. Just just the weirdness of some of them.
I've been thinking this the whole way through as I've been prepping for this series of episodes, and the names are just incredible.
Brilliant. Beaver Dams has to be one of my favorites.
I think we need to hold a vote at the end of this month at what has been the best battle name out of War of 1812 month. It's a thing. It's an entity.
It has to be done. It has to be done. I want to know all of the weird names because I'm sure there are weirder names out there. But so he was also at that battle. He was also at the Battle of Chippewa in 1814 with a small force of Iroquois and opposed a similar irregular group, which included, amongst others, the great orator Red Jacket, another Iroquois friendly to the USA. This just goes to show that it wasn't just the British that got Native American support. Some people thought, well, if we ally with the big, powerful USA, they'll be our friends and we'll be able to work with them. Everybody has an answer to a problem that is probably beyond an answer. But getting back to Norton, after the war, he disappears from the record because, no one really knows even when he was born. He's a very mysterious chap in that sense, although he did leave a journal. But that was only published in the 1970s. And the last record we have of him is in 1826. And there's one record that says he died in 1827. But Norton was similar, as in terms of his legacy, he was similar in some ways to another individual from the previous generation who died in 1805, a chap called William Augustus Bowles, who had sort of become part of the Muskogee. And he brilliantly, again, this should be a movie as well. He had tried to create an independent state of Muskogee in Spanish East Florida in the 1790s. Do yourself a favor and look that up and ponder if something called the State of Muskogee shouldn't be a movie. Also, take time to appreciate the flag he designed for it. It's very cool.
Quite obviously, Ridley Scott is not listening to this podcast. Otherwise, he would have hired me to advise him on kit bag. Although if he has listened to this podcast, he'll know my views on Napoleon and know that they're not really marketable for the big screen. But if Mr. Scott, master as you are of films like Gladiator and Alien and many others besides, you are in need of something that's not another Napoleon-themed movie, but nonetheless, you want to stay in the period, there you go, and hire Josh, because he's lovely to work with. So hopefully we've secured you a promising career in advising production companies, but we haven't finished this interview, so you can't go gallivanting off just yet. I'm going to make you stay. And I'm going to throw someone in from the other side into this, like a hand grenade into what's been a very, I wouldn't say fun conversation, but it's been a nice conversation. Next up, Jackson. Not nice. Deeply unpleasant individual by all accounts, but he is key to this topic nonetheless. Talk us through what he's up to.
Well, yeah, Jackson is very important for understanding what happens in the South. We've been talking about what's happening in Ohio and along Canada and stuff like that. You understand what's happening in the South and the Southwest and Southeast, indeed. All the South. What am I talking about? The South. You have to get Jackson. Now, as you say, Jackson is a person whose legacy I personally have no great liking for in practically any instance I've ever encountered it. But it is instructive to bring up people like him because from a historical standpoint, we are constantly reminded that legacies must weather the passage of time and changing values, and that things were different in the past. And even if it is distasteful, we have to confront and respect that fact, because if we could time travel, I assure you all, it would not be people like Jackson who are the minority. When you're traveling. In 1812, Jackson was the governor of Tennessee. He was around 45 years old. He had a background in the law. And also he was a planter, originally from Carolina. He was sort of like earthy, forthright, sort of down to earth enough, but I don't know, distant enough for people to get on board with him, and he was just immensely tough as well.
One of his biographers, just to give people a sense of the guy's reputation, one of his biographers, who I'm hoping to interview, we shall see if that actually transpires, described him as the first populist politician, which gives you an indication of the nature of the guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he could absolutely get people to he could absolutely convince people he was the real deal. Very much looking forward to that episode if it comes out, because I mean, as far as unpleasant individuals go, Jackson is quite interesting for the at least even for the devastation it caused. Oh dear. But having grown up during the revolution and even participated in it, he hated the British. And when war broke out, he promised 2,000 men to the struggle. President Madison, being a Federalist, didn't like Jackson, and supposedly the offer was left on the table for most of 1812. But in 1813, Jackson marched his men down towards New Orleans, where he was supposed to join the army guarding the Mississippi. But doubts as to the readiness of his men saw him halted at Natchez and ordered to hand over his supplies prior to disbanding his troops. Jackson was determined to prove a point and handed over his supplies and then marched back to Tennessee, paying for it out of his own pocket, just to prove that his men were in good shape. This was a terrible decision. He managed it. He got a lot of respect, but his men suffered appallingly. It was a ridiculous move from a prideful man, but that was Jackson. I mean, if you strip away all the legends about his flinty and honest character, you'll find that he rarely planned a campaign that didn't end with his men suffering in some way, most of the time anyway. And he tended to blame others when stuff went wrong as well. But, you know, populist politicians do tend to do that. He wasn't a regular army officer either. He was a militia general, and he would overstep the line a lot of times. He executed a regular infantryman once, and he was not technically allowed to do that. But he also dealt with mutinies and juggling the fact that the majority of his troops were 60-day militia volunteers. And from that point of view, of course, it was very impressive that he managed to actually conduct campaigns with 60-day drafts, men who would be going home soon and usually didn't like having to do the stuff he was asking them to do. In 1812, Tecumseh had gone into the Muskogee Nation briefly and preached his message. And as we've seen before, Little Turtle was proved correct. The results were civil war. Those who rejected the message were cultivated by the USA, and the adherents of Tecumseh's gospel were called the War Party or the Red Sticks, due to the Muskogee practice, apparently, of painting their war clubs red. And in 1813, this internecine struggle spilled over into the murder of white settlers at Fort Mims. There was a military aspect to this too. It just overflowed into the massacre of basically everybody who was in the fort. An impressive victory, therefore, marred by this horrendous event. However, the Red Sticks felt that this massacre was just retaliation for the American attack on them at Burnt Corn Creek, and then the others say that it was because of this, and the others say because of this, and go on and on and on and on. But do please look into it for yourselves, see where the trail leads. It's not very pretty. Jackson, as governor of Tennessee, was the nearest authority to quash the uprising, or at least one of the most active anyway, because Alabama and Georgia did get in on the action as well. The Creek War, or the Red Stick War, lasted until 1814, and it was mostly one-sided. It lasted so long because the limitations of the militia system and bad coordination from the US forces, most of which were militia, and one of whom was actually Davy Crockett, and the other one was Sam Houston, plus Jackson's own often poor handling of his men, saw the struggle last longer than it needed to. And a Muskogee Civil War therefore became a fight that would inevitably see the nation massively reduce. Jackson won a string of victories, though. He was opposed by most famously a war leader of mixed birth. There's a trend here, named William Weatherford. And in March 1814, Jackson cornered Weatherford and his second in command, another mixed race chief named Menawa, in a fortified loop of the Tallapoosa River called Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. The battle was hard fought, with the Muskogee having built artillery-proof barricades, absorbing the round shot that Jackson tried to break it down with, thus forcing him to overcome them with the bayonet. And he put the Red Sticks to flight, many of whom fled to their Seminole cousins in Florida. The loss here incurred forced the Muskogee to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which ceded 23 million acres, I've read it at one account state, to the United States. And, well, that basically cut the entire nation's territory in half, maybe more than in half, and left them in a very sorry state indeed. Jackson, militarily speaking, then followed up his success by marching on Pensacola, where the Spanish, who were allies of the British at this point, we must remember, were allowing the British to supply the Red Sticks with munitions. And in fact, Jackson even found a letter in Spanish to the Red Sticks congratulating them on the capture of Fort Mims. So he had a lot of reason, you might say, to go and just tramp over a nation he was not, that the United States was not at war with, breaking a great deal of international treaties and laws in doing so, but he did it. He drove the British off into the Gulf of Mexico, but fearing that the British fleet he had driven out of Pensacola would just hop along to Mobile and attack that, he turned his men around and started marching west on the road that would eventually lead him to New Orleans, where he would fight a relatively well-known battle. You might have heard of it. And, you know, it wouldn't do him any harm in the long run to be associated with the defense of New Orleans. Let's put it that way.
Indeed. And one of the significant elements of New Orleans, of course, is that he can position himself as architect of the defeat of the British, something which some of his colleagues elsewhere in the nation hadn't been able to achieve. So in terms of legacy for the War of 1812, for the Native Americans specifically, is this as simple as just saying Jackson?
In some case, well, certainly in the South, yes, it is. Jackson is also very much involved in the continuing wars in the South and the Seminole Wars as well. He's called into that mess. But, you know, Tecumseh has a very strong legacy in popular imagination as well. He and his brother are sort of a beacon of idealism and hope of what might have been a grand confederation or union of states that could possibly have opposed the progress of the United States. Some of this is unrealistic. As we've seen, Tecumseh caused as much internecine strife as he did bring unity, but we can't be too harsh. He wasn't given the time. And as we know all too well, one Native American, well, as he knew, all too well, one Native American was not the same as the next, despite what the United States thought. It can't be ignored that two presidents of the United States, Harrison and Tyler, and to be honest, Horseshoe Bend didn't do Jackson any harm at all, pretty much won their elections based on their reputations garnered in service in wars against these people. If Jackson hadn't won at New Orleans, he'd probably not have got his administration, though maybe the Red Stick War would have been enough. It's hard to say, but if he didn't win, maybe there wouldn't have been an Indian Removal Act. So though what injustice would have replaced it is anyone's guess. The War of 1812, to be honest, muddies the waters, I think, on what was really going on in the territories, because this is the second stage, like I said before, of the great struggle to resist the Euro-Americans. And it had begun first with the Northwest Frontier War, then Tecumseh's War, the Red Stick War, which was and it represents multiplied millions of acres of land removed from the nations who claimed sovereignty over them. From the seeds planted by this series of costly conflicts grew the germ of Indian removal and the wars of Black Hawk and the Seminoles which followed, the latter of which lasted into the 1850s, but despite which saw the United States finally establish territory from the sea to the Mississippi, and as we all know, it didn't stop there.
It's a very poetic point on which to end. Josh, thank you as ever, my friend, for a masterclass in stuff that I was completely clueless about. I felt like I should be taking notes on this one. Genuinely, I have been educated this evening. So thank you as ever for coming and joining us and for enlightening us the contents of your brain. I don't know how you kind of know so much about so much. It's incredible. People, I've advertised this book many times. I make no apologies for doing it again. Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira, published by Hellion. Go direct to the publisher to purchase it, please. I implore you. You will also find that Wild East was published by Josh. Apologies, I forget, was that Hellion or not Hellion?
That's Fonthill.
That's Fonthill. And that isn't Napoleonic in nature, but nonetheless, if you're enjoying Josh imparting his knowledge, you're going to want to go and buy it. Adventures in Historyland, you'll find it on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button. Don't headbutt it, just hit it. And you'll also find Josh on Twitter at Land of History. Josh, my good friend, thank you so much. And I'll see you again very, very soon, I'm sure.
Thank you very much.
A big thank you, as always, to my Patreon supporters, my Emperor-level patrons Mark Stoos, JC Kaiser, and Todd and Laird Campbell. My Marshall patrons, Matt Bone, Marcus Cribb, Roy Muir, Liam Telfer, Ger Brown, Graham Swidenbank, Colin Zimmerman, and duo Teixeira. My Commander patrons, John Haynes, Jane Davis, Bob Burnham, Andy Meakin, Michael Guest, and Ross Flowers. And my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rachel Stark, Noah Fink, Andrew Wright, David Maxwell, M. Duck, Anthony Gumbau, Chris Pramus, Mars Reedy, Alexandra Leon, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Beatrice de Graaf, Brendan Teeling, Colin Fieldhouse, Ed Koss, Bruins Girl, Jeff Maple, Hugh Brennan, Indiana Fats, Jim Deary, Jim Getz, Josh Keeney, Lucy Tatner, Lynn Dawson, Mark Anscombe, Rob Griffith, Ryan Diamond, Rob Coughlin, Mark Trowbridge, Nick Overland, Stephen Coulson, Graham Goodwin, Graham Spicer, Keys Bishop, and David Preece. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.